Thank you, Mr. President. I rise for the difficult task of urging you to vote no on this bill in its current form. And I want to give you just a couple minutes of explanation why, because I don't want to vote no with no explanation. For context, I voted for the final product of Austin's Law last year. The reason is because the bill went to the House, it got changed a little bit, and it came back in some very important ways. Remember, last term, Austin's Law was an involuntary manslaughter charge, an aggravated charge, that had to do with fentanyl specifically. Now, the final product of the bill did not have an intent or knowledge element. What I mean by that is you can still be guilty of the aggravated involuntary manslaughter even if you don't know that there's fentanyl involved in the substance. But what we did do in the House, and for final passage here, is we limited the aggravated involuntary manslaughter charge to cases where somebody is either selling or manufacturing. And that's an important distinction, the production side of this versus just the possession side of having drugs. The reason it's important to target the production side is because if you target the possession side, which this bill does, then you are recreating the mistakes of the last few decades of American war on drugs policy. And I want to say, with respect to the LG's office, my good friend from the 8th, and the Walters family, who I know has to go through a lot even just to be here, and I want to show the utmost respect for their loss and their pain, and the loss and the pain of so many families who have gone through this. We have to be able to draw a line that reflects sensible public policy. So what the war on drugs did, starting under Nixon and continuing under Reagan, is it criminalized mere possession of drugs, mandatory minimums, hundreds of billions of dollars dedicated to failed initiatives that locked people up for nonviolent offenses for long periods of time. Every policy expert on this area agrees that the war on drugs, the way that it worked, was a failure to criminalize possession alone. When you criminalize possession, you are criminalizing addiction. Because people who have addiction, which is a mental health problem, it is a disease, they will be in possession of drugs. Whether they're selling them or giving them to anybody else, they have to have them in order to use them. So when you criminalize just possession, you are sweeping into the ambit of your regulation, the criminalization of it, people who have a chemical mental health problem, a disease. When those people go to prison, they deal with their addiction problem in prison, which is often untreated, in addition to all the problems that a place like Georgia Department of Corrections currently has, as we know from the Department of Justice, and from the hundreds of millions of dollars in supplemental spending we just voted on today to address basic prison conditions that need to be better. Prison is not an answer to addiction. It is not an answer to mental health crisis. And when we tried it for decades, it just didn't work. In fact, it made the problem worse. Let me tell you a personal story really quickly. I got involved during my time in the legislature with the family of a young man who was sent to prison because he and a young woman who unfortunately died shared drugs. They did not sell them to each other. They were just people who both had a problem. They both took drugs, and one of them very tragically died. The young man went to prison, and I was in communication with his family, where he was wasting away. He was disassociating. He wasn't recognizable as the same person. Family was going to meet with him. It was hard enough to get time with him. And they were so terribly sorry about what happened to the young woman. Of course they were. I mean, can you even imagine being a parent on either side of this equation, to lose somebody or to know that your child participated in a situation where somebody was lost? Tragic. But they almost lost their son, and if it weren't for some action by the parole board, he might have died in prison. Now, the difficult thing about this, both politically and personally, emotionally, is the victim was objecting. Victims' rights in Georgia, you have the right to object to somebody's early release, and the family of the young woman consistently objected to his early release. And we can all understand why, for the same reasons we're having this conversation. Because when you suffer a loss so senseless and tragic, you want there to be an explanation. You want somebody to be held accountable. And if there's nobody within reach, if you can't reach the Mexican cartels, if you can't reach the people who sold those drugs, then of course some of that sentiment gets placed on the person who shared the drugs, who possessed them jointly with the person who died. That guy's life, the young man who got released from prison, his life was probably saved by a little bit of grace, notwithstanding that he fell on the wrong side of all of our drug laws. I want to go to the bill really quickly. SB 79 on page 2, starting line 22, you have the simple possession offense. And the enhanced penalties don't distinguish like we did last year with selling and manufacturing. It just says, if you violate subsection C, if you possess the substance, you're guilty of a felony, and these are the penalties, including mandatory minimums. Now, I want to be very clear. The Senator from the 8th is exactly right about pure fentanyl and the effects that pure fentanyl has. Pure fentanyl, unadulterated, is a nuclear bomb. Everything he said about its ability to kill, the picture of the penny, the fact that it's not readable by the scale, all true. But everything the Senator from the 8th said would be applicable only if the bill only criminalized weights according to pure fentanyl. That's not what the bill does. The bill as currently written says any mixture that contains any fentanyl. So you could have a baggie with 4 grams. There's about a teaspoon, by the way. Or, I had to Google this. I didn't know this personally. But, an 8-ball, it's like 3.5 grams. It's like a teaspoon. That's a normal amount of cocaine that somebody might buy. That mixture could be 99.99999% ordinary cocaine and just that tiny amount of fentanyl, but you'd be charged on the weight of the mixture. You would not be charged on the weight of the fentanyl. I want to be very clear. So the 4-gram cutoff, by the way, puts us into trafficking. So now you look at the next part of the bill, page 3, line 58. Did you know that if you have over 4 grams in Georgia, simple possession, this is not trying to sell it, not trying to distribute it, you just possess it. 4 grams. That's a trafficking offense in Georgia with enhanced penalties, 4 and up. So again, if you have 4 or up of one of these substances, regular cocaine, but it's got that tiny microscopic amount of fentanyl, if it tests positive, you are now liable under the trafficking provisions of this bill. And again, I can't stress enough, simple possession of that amount is what triggers the enhanced penalties under this bill. So colleagues, just like I said last term, it is the last thing I want to do on a Wednesday is come up here and speak against a bill that has a name attached to it, a person who is cherished by the family in the room, who stands on behalf of all families and lost loved ones who are affected by this crisis. But as we learn the painful lessons from the trillions of dollars, really, in the war on drugs, we need to treat addiction. We need mental health resources. We need to meet people where they are. And I'm not trying to be offensive when I say this, but the very people that this bill is designed to protect could be charged under this bill. A person who dies because of a drug that has fentanyl in it, let's assume they were arrested before they actually took the drug and died, they could be held liable under this bill for possession, and then maybe their life would be spared for the moment, but they would go to the Georgia Department of Corrections, where their addiction problems would continue, where they would deal with other crises, and the pendulum would be swinging back towards the failed policies of the 70s and 80s and beyond. Colleagues, I know that for you to vote a certain way on a bill requires, number one, that you agree with what I'm saying, but also, number two, that it be a politically tenable position, that you're not afraid to defend publicly. I get that. But I am unafraid, at least today, to stand here and tell you that criminalizing simple possession, criminalizing addiction is not good public policy. The House saved us from a worse version of this bill last year, and I supported the final version. It is my sincere prayer that the House can do something to this bill to send it back to where we are not recreating the mistakes of the last 50 to 60 years. I love and respect you, Senator from the 8th, and I'm grateful for your attention to this issue, grateful for your work. I'll yield for any questions.
You do have a couple questions, Senator. Senator from the 37th.
Does Jim yield?
I do.
You make a pretty persuasive point with respect to maybe some unintended consequences. Do you have specific language to fix what you're talking about that can tie to the quantity of fentanyl you're talking that you're referring to Do you have a fix? Do you have a recommended amendment, a friendly amendment to offer to the senator from the 8th, or not?
Wasn't prepared to do an amendment today, and I think this discussion would be much better had in a more efficient, comprehensive way in the House at this point. What I would say is, obviously, current law, as the senator from the 8th pointed out, contemplates both mandatory minimums and criminalization of simple possession. Clearly, I would like the law to move in a direction that doesn't criminalize simple possession at all. I think it's pretty harsh that we elevate to a trafficking penalty, just based on simple possession with no intent to distribute, that sort of thing. As far as an amendment to make this better today, let's do something like what we did for the aggravated involuntary manslaughter charge last year. Let's limit these aggravated penalties to production, manufacturing, selling, or even intent to distribute. Because, by the way, I mean, the aggravated involuntary manslaughter charge, we originally had a sharing element in it, which you can imagine people who are addicted sharing drugs. I might even be open, and again, not that anybody cares what my vote's going to be, but I might be open personally to an intent to distribute element sort of cleaning this up. But I think at the very least what we don't want to do is allow this type of enhanced penalty for people who simply possess with nothing more than that.
Does the senator further yield?
I do.
So if a senator were of the same mind as the senator from the 8th that wants to criminalize possession in the way he has, but wants to get the quantity correct, such that trace amounts, that's a trace amount within a larger substance is not unintended, kind of get you there. It sounds like you don't have a proposed amendment that could fix that, and you're suggesting that it's a House fix. If that's a technical fix that the senator might be friendly to.
That may be right. I mean, one thing that I got to acknowledge for the senator from the 8th is because such tiny trace amounts can be deadly and because they're hard to measure, it's actually quite difficult to use a weight-based measurement of the pure fentanyl itself to try to limit it, right? So if it were a little less potent, then maybe you could use a weight, think if the substance has this much of the pure fentanyl, et cetera. But my thought would be one way that we just avoid that is the simple possession by itself. I mean, again, intent to distribute, not too hard to establish if you've got certain quantities, I think. But you put people in a position where, again, and I don't mean to bear too hard on this point, but a person who this bill is designed to protect is potential criminal defendant under this bill. I mean, if you just have something, whether you know it or not, if somebody buys street drugs and they don't know that there's trace amounts of fentanyl in it, which way is it going to go? It could be just the vicissitudes of fate. You either die because you take the drug or you get criminally charged because you're found to be in possession of it. But I think it just creates a really tough continuation of the war on drugs.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Recognize the senator from the 41st.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you for, Senator, do you yield?
I do.
Yeah, I want to begin, isn't it true that I'm grateful to the Senator for the 8th for all of his work on this work to try to make Georgians safer?
We all are, and we share the same goal of eliminating fentanyl completely from the communities that we live in.
Yeah. Do you further yield?
I do.
Isn't it also true that many families who have been impacted by fentanyl and overdose situations have sometimes opined and said, I would rather my loved one be in prison and alive than have OD'd and died. And so there's this kind of sense that prison is a safer or better place for a loved one who's dealing with this type of addiction. However, isn't it true that just in January alone, 2 people incarcerated in Department of Corrections died of overdoses in the prison itself?
That is correct. It's an ongoing crisis that has been going on for years that we've tried to call attention to. But let's just also say, I mean, we're the legislative body for the state of Georgia, and I hope that we don't feel like we're limited to those 2 options, that somebody either dies or they're in prison with an addiction problem. I mean, the whole point of the conversation I'm trying to have today from the well is, can we not imagine a different way of approaching this problem that has to do with treatment and health care and resolving the core issues involved, as opposed to searching for at best very imperfect tool to try to respond to this problem.
Thank you.
If there are no further questions, Mr. President,
You have no further questions.
I'll yield the well. Thank you.
Senators,